Hello, astronauts. Welcome to my wacky science channel where I frequently dress up as a Starfleet officer and ask how close are we to forming the United Federation of Planets. Today, we're going to delve into the most important aspect of the transitioning to the Star Trek universe, warp drive technology.
Astra, I'm not sure that's the most important message of Star Trek.
Hi, Will. Are you here to help me in my quest to make this timeline Star Trek?
Well, this is my entire brand, so yes. But I don't think the technobabble or even futuristic scientific and engineering achievements of the Federation, as impressive as they are the most important lesson that we can learn from Star Trek. And they're certainly not the defining feature of the United Federation of Planets, no matter how impressive they are.
I guess you have a point, since Romulans, Klingons, the Dominion, the Breen, the Borg, literally most empires in Trek have warp capabilities and advanced technology, not just the Federation.
Yeah, exactly. So the thing that makes the Federation special is its ideals, but specifically its Marxist ideals, its communist ideals.
What would you say makes the Federation of Planets communist rather than capitalist or some other system?
So my question, Astra, is have you read any theory?
Yes, but I don't think it's the theory you're thinking of.
Is it about warp drive? Because I'm guessing it's about warp drive.
Yeah, I read physics theory. I don't read about Marx and Engels.
There's actually a one world government. There are no national borders within United Earth. We've eliminated poverty, war, hunger, greed, want, at least on core member worlds, especially on Earth. That's why Captain Sisko refers to Earth as a paradise. Early human history was about workers of the world uniting across borders, regardless of nationality, regardless of country, right? It can only be done when the notion of private property has been abolished, when the means to actually produce all the things of value in society are held by those that produce it themselves, the working class, right? And you can actually plan the economy based off of needs instead of profit. In the Federation, between member worlds, right, you can actually share resources, share knowledge, do cultural exchanges, scientific exchanges, regardless of the profitability of it, regardless of who owns certain intellectual property rights over certain things. Things are freely given, freely shared, freely planned. And it allowed, arguably, us to develop those things that you mentioned that were so incredible, which is warp drive, replicators, transport technology. Those things could not have been invented if it was owned by private companies, if you had to pay per use of a transporter, pay per use for a hypo spray. Back in the day, humanity used to charge for those things, healthcare. They would charge for air. They would charge for water. They would charge for anything, right? And now we just freely give it. And that is something that had to be won through struggle. And it allowed everything else to be possible.
Well, a lot of people get a little nervous when you talk about the abolition of private property. Can you maybe talk about the difference between private property and personal property? So if private property is abolished, but I have a laptop that I want to keep for myself, I don't want to have to share that laptop, is that still okay under communism?
Absolutely. That's one of the misconceptions that opponents of a new way of thinking or of an alternative way of organizing our lives. We're going to come for your clothing. We're going to come for all those things that have sentimental, personal, familial value. And it's a deliberate conflation of these things, right? The private property refers to the ideas of private entities because they can sign a piece of paper, a contract. They say they can actually own this piece of capital. And because they own this piece of capital, which produces goods and products and services and what have you, and the workers are compelled to work at these places where they have that capital. And that's where value actually comes from. Workers add their labor to capital to produce something that is greater than the sum of its parts. For capitalism, it says that we own this piece of property, this piece of capital in perpetuity. And because we own this crucial piece of machinery, crucial piece of equipment, or crucial piece of infrastructure, that allows us to have dominion, if you will, over people's lives, because people's lives are dependent upon exchanging their labor power to get a wage. What if we got rid of that? What if the workers themselves, who actually produce the real value by adding their labor power, what if they were able to actually control the means of production themselves? They're to plan and produce things to people's needs and people's wants as well.
So what you're saying is a laptop is very different than a factory.
Right? A factory is something that can be retooled, repurposed to do all sorts of things, right? It's on an order of level different than a product that is produced. By the way, capitalism didn't make a laptop, labor did. Capitalism was just the system that said, well, the people that assembled the parts may get paid slave wages, but some other company might just extract all this value from it when it was sold for a much higher price, right? Human labor with their own hands, with their own intellect made a laptop. They can make your hamburger, they can make your coffee, they can make your Ractigino, they can make anything. And that's what makes humanity so amazing, that they can do so many things. But do they actually get to enjoy the full fruits of their labor?
Before anyone thinks, well, what about all the work that went into designing the laptop and marketing the laptop? Those are also workers. That was also labor, design labor, marketing labor, research labor into what consumers wanted. All of that was still work that a wage was exchanged for. So what would you say to people who are thinking about more leftist ideals, but they view themselves as having benefited a lot from capitalism? Say people who are doctors, lawyers, who are making quite a bit of money. Are they on the side of the owners, or are they on the side of people working low-paying jobs at restaurants, as janitors, as teachers, etc.?
So I would say they're absolutely on the same side. We don't deny the fact that there are differences in how workers are compensated, arguably under capitalism incredibly unfairly, but there are differences, right, in how they're compensated. But if you're a worker who has to earn a wage, you're selling your labor power, then you are a worker. Likely sell your labor power in conjunction with others. It becomes a socialized form of production. You actually have to work with others to produce a widget, a product, a service, what have you, right? And together, collectively, produces something of great value to the capitalists, in which they take the lion's share of that and they pay you a wage. But that wage is always far lower than the value that you create to the capitalists. That's how the exploitation is always exponential, right? That's the surplus value of labor. And you do it because you fear you're going to lose your job. But your pay, if you're lucky for it to go up, doesn't go up nearly enough to match the productivity that's always constantly extracted from you. You got to work harder. You got to work faster. You got to work longer hours, right? Because you're lucky to have a job, right? But your pay will either stay stagnant, barely increase to meet inflation, or it could even go down. People in a higher paying job, you're far closer to being in a lower economic status than you actually think you are, right? That's the lie of capitalism, is that it's aspirational. Everyone is a temporarily embarrassed billionaire. And the thing is that the workers can escape their lot in life, but only if they organize accordingly. No matter how highly paid an actual worker is, they're far closer to destitution than they like to think, right? They lose their job. They have a high healthcare bill, costs that kind of then eat into their high wages, right? The high cost of housing, debt, doctors and lawyers who often say, hey, I get paid a lot of money. In a lot of ways, they're feeling the strap because they have to get paid a lot of money because their debts are so astronomical, right? Are you truly free if you have so much debt to service? When people quote unquote own their homes, oftentimes they have a mortgage. And that means you don't own the home. The bank does. You're paying back a 30-year loan just because I make so much money than an average worker. I'm not really a worker. You're absolutely a worker. But it's in the interests of the bosses to tell you, well, just because you get paid, a nice little wage and you get to have some little perks here and there, you're different than them. But those perks, by the way, can go away at any time.
But what if your boss talks about how you're not really a worker, you're really part of the family. Their company is a family. They would never lay you all off without a second thought at all, would they? You're a family to them. They care about you, right? Right?
Yeah, kind of like how pork treats Rom, right? Families can exploit each other too. If your bosses are thinking of the family in that exploitative way, then maybe they're onto something. But I think what they really mean is, oh, we're a family, we care about you, right? And we want what's best for you. We know that's not true. Why is it that you actually have to give your boss 2 weeks, if not more, notice when you leave? But they can fire you at the drop of a hat and they can escort you out that day, that minute, that second. The reason why they do those types of things is to confuse and demoralize and redirect workers, to really blur the lines of any class differences, any class antagonisms, right? It's emotional blackmail. You have the freedom to starve. You have the freedom to be homeless. You have the freedom to be bankrupt for a medical bill. What kind of freedom is that? We're all in it together. And it's even more egregious during Pride Month. All these companies slap a logo that's a rainbow or has the bi or trans colors on it, and that's all they do.
Oh, no, it's not all they do. They also donate to a lot of anti-gay politicians and a lot of anti-trans politicians. These anti-trans and anti-gay politicians, they're just better financially. Yes, we'll support all of these like awful homophobic, transphobic people who are trying to take your rights away financially. But that's not where our hearts are. I feel like they're living their truth. And their truth is just fucking us all over.
It's true to accept quote unquote diversity. They're just extra dollars for them to chase. Oh, they can market to them in a different way. That's why you have the farce of these rainbow washed companies doing what they're doing.
So I guess my question to you is it better to be a farcical market share or to be excluded from society and hunted down by police officers?
There's another way. Malcolm X had a great line: you can't have capitalism without racism. The only way to eliminate the situation where that type of oppression can happen to gay people and trans people and black people, any type of minority, any type of marginalized community, is to put the workers themselves, who are all of those identities and so much more, in a position to call the shots themselves. We don't need the bosses if the workers themselves are their own bosses. If we elect our own bosses, if we recall our bosses at any time, if they're not doing the right job, we can do it ourselves. We can manage ourselves. Marxists have always supported every gain that's achieved by the working class in civil rights, LGBT rights, all those types of stuff. We celebrate and defend any of those types of gains. But the reason why we do that is because we understand the only reason why those rights were even given in the first place was because the ruling class was afraid that they would go further. Those rights are actually tied to the question of power, and is the working class in power? So we'll give you those rights right now as long as the underlying dynamics stay the same, as long as we can still make money, as long as we can still kind of keep the order of things as it is. But we support all those rights that are given to people. And then we demand more. Deep down, most people know how phony it all is. Everything changes and yet nothing changes, really.
I don't think you're saying that communism will solve racism, solve sexism, solve homophobia and transphobia. I think what you're saying is that it will remove the dramatic incentives to perpetuate those harmful bigotries and therefore allow us to move forward. It's not a solution, it's more a prerequisite.
In a way, yeah. Over time, racial prejudices can actually begin to change and be ameliorated. It's when Black workers, white workers, Asian workers, Latino workers, what have you, when they actually work side by side, struggling against the bosses themselves, that they understood that actuality, maybe all of the caricatures we were told, all the stereotypes that we were told aren't true. And in fact, they're just people like us as well. Rubbing shoulder to shoulder in that struggle is the best way to start breaking down some of those age-old indoctrinated prejudices and biases. And we're not saying, like you said, that you wave a magic wand. It's not utopian in that way, but it provides an actual concrete step by step, to actually begin to break that down. Marxism, which is dialectical materialism, is a science unto itself as well. It's scientific in the way that there are things that can be observed. How does the working class move in these struggles, the lessons that they learn as they move into action, as they begin to go into general strikes, as they begin to organize themselves. You can generalize certain things regarding human society, human relationships, human dynamics. That's what makes socialism achievable. Ultimately, communism achievable as well, which is the final stage beyond socialism. You hear oftentimes Star Trek is just utopia, the Federation is just utopia, almost like a dream that can never quite be fulfilled, which is not what Marxists believe whatsoever. It's eminently achievable. We live in a post-scarcity society now. We can feed and house every single person on this planet. We don't need replicators to do that. We actually have that technology.
On this channel, we have a saying, it's only science if you can test the theory. Many people would argue that communism has been tested and failed many times. Many nations have tried out socialist or communist models, and many have fallen or failed or reverted back to a capitalist state. What would you say to that very common argument?
It hasn't been achieved because it's a worldwide thing. Communism has not yet been achieved because there has not yet been a stateless, classless society on Earth. Now, there have been revolutions that have attempted to move in that direction. October 1917, Russia, the Bolshevik Revolution, which had the best principles of a proletarian revolution, had the best principles of legitimate workers' democracy. That became degenerated over time. And then there's a lot of reasons why the Soviet Union became the first worker state, but also became the first degenerated worker state. A lot of it had to do with the delay of the revolution in other countries. It had to do with the isolation of the Soviet Union, the isolation of that worker state, and the inability for it to get relief from other countries, right? Communism is an international endeavor. Socialism is an international endeavor. It has not yet happened on that global scale yet. Has there been revolutions that have achieved significant gains? Absolutely. And as a Marxist and as a communist, I would support any revolution that has eliminated capitalism, eliminated landlordism, that has achieved tangible gains for the working class. But that doesn't mean that there hasn't been distortions and deviations along the way. Some that call themselves communists that actually distorted the whole endeavor itself. But it's actually used by capitalists to then say, you know what? That is an example of communism writ large. That's an example of communism as a principle as a whole. Therefore, it's useless to attempt anything different than what we have right now. But there has not yet been a final victory of the revolution on a world scale, which is what's necessary, because capitalism is a world system and you can't tackle it piecemeal. The belief that you can actually build socialism in one country, that's actually the belief of the bureaucracy under Stalin and many others, that you can actually build socialism in one country and that was sufficient. And that actually laid the groundwork for its eventual demise and downfall. Same thing with the People's Republic of China, that you can build socialism in one country. That's not possible. That's not what the original Bolsheviks or Lenin believed. That's not why Lenin himself established the Communist International. And there are tremendous and terrible distortions that happen when a revolution becomes isolated and you have an emergence of a bureaucracy. Exactly what happened in the Soviet Union and in many of these other worker states. There's a wealth of history of these previous revolutions. You have to understand what happened and then, more importantly, apply those lessons going forward. I think that's the only way you kind of get to where you need to be. The previous stage to that is socialism, which is the establishment of a worker state as an entity that can actually mitigate and eventually eliminate those class distinctions and class antagonism. But the workers need a state to prevent a counter-revolution, prevent the restoration of capitalism, address some of the inequalities that was present in the previous system, which was capitalism.
What would you say to someone who isn't necessarily sure whether they agree with you, but would like to learn more, or someone who thinks, oh, well, this is all good in theory, but a worldwide communist utopia isn't going to, or even a worldwide communist state isn't going to happen within my lifetime. What can I do to make things better for the workers?
There's actually a lot that you could do. I'm actually of the belief that socialism can be achieved in our lifetime. That doesn't mean it will be easy. That doesn't mean there won't be setbacks, but it's possible with the right organization. The reason why I say that is because of the idea of revolutionary optimism. That doesn't mean hoping against hope that a revolution's around the corner. That doesn't mean that we're naive. Engels himself wrote a great book called Socialism, Utopian or Scientific. There is a scientific method to actually approach the building of a conscious working class movement that can work towards emancipation. We analyze capitalism as a historical event, and we know that right now it's at an historical impasse. It has no way out of its crisis of overproduction. We actually produce far more than actually is consumed by most people. It doesn't meet people's needs. But people actually can't buy back what they actually produce, right? So it leads to this cycle of boom and bust that happens almost all the time now. Capitalism doesn't have a way forward. It means that there will be continued intensification of the class struggle in this period. More and more people will begin to go into struggle. Almost kind of like water boiling in a kettle. It's in that intermediary stage right now where it's not quite water vapor, but it's not quite liquid water. It's in that intermediary stage. And for the first time, you brought up the United States. I think for the first time, the United States is actually kind of at the forefront a lot of this pre-revolutionary ferment. Last year, with the George Floyd protests, you had a tremendous outpouring of energy into the streets. Almost 10% of the United States, about 26 million people participating in these protests, right? That had an increasingly radical nature, right? Abolish the police, people taking to the streets week after week for months. All of a sudden, with people in the streets, with this amount of people in the streets, all 50 states, we had everyone kneeling all of a sudden. All the cops were kneeling. All of a sudden, there was plenty of money to defund the police. There were calls to abolish the police in its entirety. Things have kind of stabilized since then, but that kind of shows you the revolutionary potential that is there. What if that was actually channeled to where the workers themselves had their most power, in their proximity to the means of production, their workplaces? Imagine that 26 million people became 50 million people, and they took to the streets, but they also took to their workplaces. They took to Amazon warehouses, they took to the grocery stores, to their schools, the train stations, the airports, right? And they shut down the economy on what we call a general strike with political demands, right? You want to stop deportations, you want to stop kids being put in cages, you want to stop the police are murdering Black people, right? What if you actually couple those demands with work stoppages, a general strike? You saw some of it happening in Italy. Some dock workers and also some workers in South Africa that were union dock workers refused to load their ships in support for Palestinians. That's the power of the working class flexing its muscles. But you have to be organized to do that, right? So you have to build an organization in advance of these social struggles. But we know that unfortunately there's going to be another George Floyd. We know that unfortunately there's going to be another climate strike. We know there's going to be yet another incident on the border. We have to build right now, talk about our program, talk about our history, talk about theory, talk about what's happening in the world and say there is a way forward. Why doesn't the labor movement actually call for its own workers' party to run its own candidate, use the resources of organized labor, all those union dues, to actually put towards socialist candidates? What we can do right now is actually political education. The George Floyd protests, what happened a year later? As soon as everyone went back home, that's when things re-solidified, reconsolidated. That is what we want to avoid the next time, so that the next social explosion that happens, we can actually meet these layers of people, win them over to revolutionary program, and then hopefully win enough people to get to a point where we can actually demand of the larger worker movement and the larger labor movement in the United States to say, why don't we actually have a mass political party of the working class for the working class?
A common theme you talk about is unity, international unity among all the workers. And I'm just thinking of leftist spaces everywhere. And there's a running joke that nobody hates leftists more than other leftists. You don't just have Marxists who want capitalism to progress to socialism and then communism. You have people who support a mixed economy, people who are really interested in a few different policies. You have straight up anarchists. Honestly, I don't know if I could get a room full of leftists to all agree that my dog is the cutest in the world, like an objective fact. And I don't think I could get a room full of leftists to agree. So how do you get people who can't even agree on the cuteness of a puppy to agree to organize, to agree to a general strike, to even agree to a list of demands?
You don't necessarily have to convince all leftists, if you will. You actually have to convince the working class. And that's not a glib answer. You win them over, both the other leftists and the working class in general, by patiently explaining and let experience, trusting in your method and letting experience, i.e. what's happening in the real world, be the final arbiter. Patiently explain, but be firm in your method. The correct perspective is borne out by reality. Being able to self-correct when events and experiences prove otherwise as well. Are you able to change your position, adapt your position tactically as well? We have a real good shot, and we've done it before in the past, and winning people over, saying, you know what, I didn't agree with you back then. What you said that one time actually stuck with me because something else happened down the road. I want to hear more. Those are the people you actually can win over time. You can't win over everyone, and that's okay. You just have to win over enough people. But it's not a question of winning over everyone. And it's also not a question of denouncing everyone. It's a question of winning over the right people and the right amount of people. And the right amount of people is always going to be the massive workers themselves. And if you win those people over without watering down your program, that actually has a real good shot of convincing the leftists saying, hey, you know what, maybe actually your perspective is the right one because you're actually winning over people that were so-called apolitical. Because a lot of leftists burn out. It's all that single issue campaigning. They can't care about so many issues. Your consistency, your longevity of still being out there, doing that type of work, being visible, being organized, and more importantly, being knowledgeable what you're saying, will say, hey, you're the ones that are still out here talking about these certain types of things. You must be doing something right, or I want to learn more. I want to hear more.
You are very optimistic, and you talk a lot about organizing and getting ready for the next big social awakening and social unrest. But falling into nihilism from this revolutionary optimism is so easy because you referenced the George Floyd protests, but we also remember the March for Our Lives protests. We also remember the protests over kids in cages. We remember the Women's March right after Trump was elected. We remember all of these climate protests. We remember a history of dozens of moments that led to nothing. What are your methods for retaining your optimism despite this long list of missed opportunities?
You can't do it alone, right? So just like it's Starfleet, you can't do it alone. For me, that's what keeps me anchored, being part of an actually international organization with sections worldwide in now over 40 countries. A lot of what politics is knowing what to do next, analyzing the situation, knowing what to do next. I care about gay rights. I care about the environment, gun violence, militarism, and they are oftentimes treated as discrete things. The only way to look at it in a way that actually resolves all of it is to recognize all of them are symptoms. And then once you identify the larger problem, then you have to identify what the solution is, the final boss, if you will. And that's private property, the private ownership of property, capitalism itself. It's a lot of preparatory work, but what gives me optimism is understanding that there are certain things that you can do. It's that internationalism. There's a seething anger that's underneath the surface. It's looking for a way out. It's looking for an outlet. And we have to build that outlet for that. Steam, like I said before, but we need to build a steam engine, because if we don't have a steam engine to trap and use that steam to power a piston, then that steam will just dissipate. All the movements of the past will just, as much steam is produced, if it's not trapped and harnessed, then that steam will just dissipate. What we have to do right now is actually build that steam engine, nut by nut, bolt by bolt, piece by piece in advance. What happened in October 1917 with the Bolshevik Revolution was the greatest event in human history because they were able to organize themselves in a way that they were able to win the working class, take power, but actually really firing a single shot because they had actually won over the majority of the working class within Russia at that time. We actually have to build an organization that kind of provides that bridge, provides that scaffolding, that skeleton, if you will, to then say, you know what, what's going on in Seattle, what's going on in Zuccotti Square in New York is actually tied to what's happening in Tahrir Square in Egypt, in the Arab Spring. It tied all together, right? You have to build an organization on that level internationally to link up those types of struggles. Those struggles are seeking oxygen to survive. And if one revolution is successful, it can inspire so many others. But that's also exactly why capitalism expends so much energy and so many bombs and cruise missiles and drones to kill out any nascent movement, because it can spread. The water's bubbling. It's bubbling more and more and more and more, right? So it's our job to kind of lift up that lid, to build those connections. It's the hardest thing humanity will ever have to do. It's harder than warp drive. It was probably easier to achieve faster than light travel than this.
Organizing an international coalition of all the working class en masse seems very difficult.
Well, when you put it that way, I guess some people would say warp drive will happen before fully automated luxury gate-based communism.
Yeah, I'm not so sure about that.
Well, at least that's what the science tells me. I saw a few articles of potential new warp drive solutions that got me very excited.
Well, those theoretical solutions don't mean that warp drive is feasible from an engineering standpoint yet. Let me explain. First, we need to define warp drive. Warp drive is technobabble for getting around the universal speed limit or speed of light by bending space, compressing space-time in front of your ship and expanding space-time behind your ship. Remember, while objects can't travel through space faster than light, space-time itself can expand, stretch, fold, etc., without a known limit. In fact, the universe itself is currently expanding faster than light.
Wait, hold on, Astra. Are you saying warp drive is actually possible?
Within the confines of general relativity, warp drive is technically, theoretically possible, according to 4 papers that I'll go over. They're not the only papers that discuss warp travel, but they give a pretty good illustration of where the theory's at right now.
Are we sure this is a video about Star Trek or a physics journal club?
Oh, well, most of my videos are both. In 1994, Miguel Alcubierre showed that warp drive was theoretically possible. So how can you bend space like this? Well, the same way you always bend space. Gravity. Specifically, you need a large positive mass in front of your ship to compress space-time and a large negative mass behind your ship to expand space-time. Wait, no, that can't be right.
Did you say negative mass?
Okay, maybe this theory isn't super practical because we're pretty sure negative mass doesn't exist.
Well, does this paper suggest any other options?
Okay, hold on. Okay, it looks like we could use a ring of negative energy density.
Okay, what in space is that?
Hold on, I haven't read that far yet. Okay. Yes. To create negative energy density, you need an imbalance in the force. Sorry, wrong franchise. You need an imbalance between particles and antiparticles, which means a huge mass.
But wait a second, isn't that the opposite of the negative mass you mentioned earlier?
I know, that's only an obvious alternative if you studied quantum mechanics at the academy, which neither of us did. Basically, sometimes particle and antiparticle pairs just pop into existence from nothing, mainly because quantum mechanics is your messy drunk friend and the universe can't be bothered to keep track of the little things. Usually, these particle-antiparticle pairs pop into existence, enjoy a fleeting life, then meet back up to collide and annihilate each other before anyone knows they were there in the first place. But what happens if those particles don't meet back up and annihilate each other? We talked about how that happens with black holes sometimes and causes Hawking radiation. But say an electron and a positron spontaneously appear near your warp core, which is functionally a supermassive black hole, and one of the particles gets trapped inside. This event results in an imbalance between matter and antimatter. This imbalance results in a negative energy density. You can use that negative energy density to create the space-time bubble. It's like your negative mass.
Astra, are you saying that warp cores are artificial, supermassive black holes?
Yeah, pretty much. And for a warp drive to generate enough negative energy, you would need a huge imbalance, which means a lot of mass. Alcubierre estimated that a warp drive with a 100-meter bubble would require a mass of the entire universe, which is a lot to contain within engineering.
Wow, that paper really stretched the limits of the definition of theoretically possible.
Don't worry, we still have 3 more papers to review.
I'll be honest, when I asked if you read theory, this wasn't really what I meant.
Too late. In 1999, Chris Vandenbroek showed that you can dramatically reduce this mass by making the wall of the warp bubble microscopically small while keeping the inside volume big enough for your starship. Now, how do you do this? By adding a second warp bubble, of course. The outer bubble is the one that contracts space in front and expands it behind your tiny little warp bubble. Then there's an inner bubble of curved space that blows up the inside to starship size. It's bigger on the inside. Chris Vandenbroek made a TARDIS. Ant-Man went to the quantum zone. Honey, I Shrunk the Enterprise. There once was a little ship which took a little trip. Alice ate the Wonderland mushroom. This change would reduce the energy requirements significantly to just a few solar masses.
So I guess that's technically less impossible. Please say the final 2 papers say we don't need to cram several suns into the warp core.
Well, flash forward to March and April of 2021, after a year of theoretical astrophysicist Trekkies having far too much time on their hands. Some of them chose to watch DS9 in lower decks, take up daily hiking and running, and adopt a puppy.
Others make communist memes and advocate for workers' rights and universal health care.
Others choose to solve the negative energy issue with warp drive. Alexei Bobrik and Gianni Martire modify space-time within the warp bubble to remove the need for negative energy. But with their solution, you can't accelerate to faster than the speed of light, which sort of defeats the purpose. But they did still do a lot of mathematical groundwork, for example, showing that certain ship shapes are actually more energy efficient than others.
So is the Enterprise an efficient design?
Unfortunately, no, since you want the ship to be flatter in the direction of travel, but rotate the saucer section 90 degrees and you've got a pretty good ship design.
So physicists are saying that warp drive should be flying saucers that travel in the least aerodynamic way possible?
Yes, it's fine. There's no air resistance in space.
Okay, so that paper was just really, really math heavy and a huge bummer. But a win for retro sci-fi. So I really hope that the last paper you make me learn is better because I came here to talk about communism, but now I'm really invested in what bored physicists have to say about superliminal warp drives.
So Eric Lenz's paper actually does allow you to go faster than light without using negative energy. And it completely changes the geometry and method.
Was this Lenz's quarantine project?
According to Lenz, yes. But just go with him here.
Engage.
So first you have to take a fluid with immense mass made into plasma and some electromagnetic fields.
Well, good thing I always keep my EM field generator handy.
Great. You arrange the plasma and EM fields into several slim diamonds around your ship. This makes your warp bubble.
I'm writing this down. Plasma, EM fields, diamond stencils, spaceship. Got it.
So your warp bubble is technically a soliton, or a standing wave. This is important since it's not point-like. There's a theorem in general relativity that says you can't go faster than light without negative energy if you have a point-like object. This is because there's a single fastest pathway. With a wave, you have multiple equally fast pathways from one point to another. Now, Ken Olam, the guy behind the theorem, says that this is an impractical cheat since any small disturbance would turn the wave into a point, making Olam's theory apply. But Lenz says there aren't obvious perturbations that would reduce the soliton wave to a point-like state. There's a lot of drama in this space right now.
That sounds a lot like the drama about whether China is still a socialist state or not. But aside from physicists and leftist infighting, what are the real obstacles to making this warp drive and Star Trek a reality?
Well, you do need about 10% of the sun's mass converted into pure energy if you want to reach warp factor 1, so the speed of light, c. And there's no suggestion for how to construct any of this from an engineering perspective. But this paper shows that warp drive is consistent with our current laws of physics.
So what you're finally saying is that getting leftists to come together under a common purpose is more likely.
I'm not sure I would go that far, but hopefully both will happen sooner than we expect. Thank you so much to Will Nguyen for joining me on this video. If you would like to learn more about communist causes going on now, about the theory behind communism, or organizations you can join and causes you can fight for, please check out the links in the description. Astra out.
Astra, to the stars, to the stars.